Millionaire's son invites his humble maid to a luxury party to humiliate her. When she arrives, everyone is shocked. Ready for a journey full of nostalgia and incredible twists, today's story is truly remarkable, with an ending that's sure to touch your heart and leave you amazed. So, stay with me until the very last moment. I hope this experience is unforgettable for you, and may God bless you and your family. Now, let's get started. Margaret Wilson wiped the sweat from her brow as she polished the marble floors of the Thompson mansion. At 19, she had been working as a maid for the wealthy family for almost a year, trying to help her widowed mother make ends meet. The familiar scent of lemon-scented cleaning products filled the air as she worked, her worn sneakers squeaking against the freshly polished surface. The mansion was a testament to 1980s luxury. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, expensive artwork adorned the walls, and the latest technological marvels like the brand-new VCR player sat in their entertainment room. It was a world away from Margaret's modest two-bedroom apartment where she lived with her mother in the working-class part of town. Richard Thompson Jr, the 20-year-old son of her employer, descended the curved staircase, his polo shirt perfectly pressed and his loafers gleaming. Margaret quickly moved aside, keeping her eyes down as she had been taught. But Richard stopped directly in front of her, clearing his throat to get her attention. "Margaret, isn't it?" he asked, though she knew he remembered her name perfectly well. His voice carried that peculiar tone of feigned politeness that always made her uncomfortable. "Yes, Mr. Thompson," she replied quietly, still avoiding his gaze. "I'm having my birthday celebration this Saturday evening. It's going to be quite the event. Everyone who's anyone will be there." He paused, watching her reaction carefully. "I'd like you to come." Margaret's head snapped up in surprise, her brown eyes finally meeting his blue ones. She searched his face for any sign of mockery, but found only an unreadable expression. I couldn't possibly," she stammered, clutching her cleaning cloth tightly. "Oh, but I insist," Richard said, pulling an elegant ivory envelope from his back pocket. "Here's your invitation. It's a black tie event, of course. I'm sure you can find something appropriate to wear." The way he emphasized the word appropriate made Margaret's cheeks burn. She knew her wardrobe consisted mainly of second-hand clothes and her work uniforms. The closest thing she had to formal wear was the dress she'd worn to her high school graduation 2 years ago. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson, but I won't take no for an answer," he interrupted, pressing the envelope into her hands. "Besides, my father always says we should reward good service. You've been very diligent in your duties." Before she could protest further, Richard had already turned and walked away, leaving Margaret standing there with the expensive invitation in her trembling hands. She looked down at it, the gold lettering catching the light from the chandelier above. That evening, as Margaret recounted the strange encounter to her mother over their modest dinner of meatloaf and potatoes, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "Why would he invite me, Mum? I'm just the maid," Margaret said, pushing her food around her plate. Her mother, Ellen, a woman worn by years of hard work but still maintaining a gentle beauty, studied her daughter's troubled face. "Perhaps he's trying to be kind," Margaret shook her head. "You don't know Richard Thompson Jr, Mum. He's never shown any interest in being kind to the help before. Just last week, I overheard him mocking the gardener's accent with his friends." Ellen reached across their small kitchen table and squeezed her daughter's hand. "Then don't go, sweetheart. No one can force you to attend." But Margaret couldn't stop thinking about the invitation. She pulled it out again, reading the elegant script. "You are cordially invited to celebrate the 21st birthday of Richard Thompson Jr. at the Grand Plaza Hotel." The Grand Plaza was the most expensive hotel in town, a towering structure of glass and steel that represented everything Margaret's world wasn't. She had only seen it from the outside, walking past it on her way to work, watching as limousines pulled up to its entrance. That night, as Margaret lay in her narrow bed, listening to the distant sound of traffic and the rattling of their old air conditioning unit, she made a decision. She would go to the party, not because she believed Richard's sudden invitation was sincere, but because she wanted to prove something, to him, to herself, to everyone who had ever looked down on her because of her circumstances. The next day at work, Margaret noticed subtle changes in how Richard and his friends treated her. They would whisper and snicker when she passed, quickly falling silent when she came too close. Once, she overheard a snippet of conversation that made her stomach turn. "Just wait until Saturday," Richard was saying to his friend Bradley. "It's going to be epic." The words confirmed her suspicions, but instead of deterring her, they strengthened her resolve. She had 1 week to prepare, 1 week to transform herself from a maid into someone who could walk into the Grand Plaza Hotel with her head held high. After work, Margaret visited every thrift store in town, searching for something that could pass for elegant evening wear. In the third store, tucked between dated polyester dresses and worn prom gowns, she found it. A black velvet dress from the early 80s, simple but classic, with a modest neckline and a length that fell just below her knees. It needed minor repairs, but her mother was skilled with a needle and thread. "Are you sure about this, Margaret?" her mother asked as she helped her try on the altered dress. "I have a feeling that boy isn't planning anything good." Margaret looked at her reflection in their bathroom mirror, hardly recognizing herself. The dress fit perfectly now, highlighting her slender figure. "I'm sure, Mom, sometimes you have to face your fears head-on." As Saturday approached, tension built in the Thompson mansion. Margaret continued her duties as usual, but she could feel eyes following her everywhere she went. Richard's friends visited more frequently, and their poorly concealed laughter echoed through the halls. The day before the party, while Margaret was cleaning the library, she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Richard was speaking to someone on the house phone, his voice carrying through the partially open door. "Everything's set for tomorrow. When she walks in, God, I can't wait to see her face. It's going to be the highlight of the party." Margaret's hands trembled as she dusted the bookshelves, but she forced herself to keep working. Whatever Richard had planned, she would face it with dignity. She hadn't spent 19 years watching her mother persevere through hardship to back down now. That night, as she laid out her dress and the modest costume jewelry she'd borrowed from her mother, Margaret felt a strange calm settle over her. Tomorrow would either be her greatest triumph or her most humbling moment, but either way, she would face it on her own terms. Little did she know that the events of the following evening would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone involved, in ways none of them could have anticipated. Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear. Margaret woke early, her stomach in knots as she thought about the evening ahead. The invitation had specified that the party would begin at 8 o'clock, giving her the entire day to prepare, both mentally and physically. She went to work as usual, knowing it would be her last chance to observe any final preparations or overhear any details about what Richard might have planned. The Thompson mansion was buzzing with activity. Florists arrived with elaborate arrangements for Richard's pre-party gathering. Caterers prepared hors d'oeuvres in the kitchen, and service staff polished every surface until it gleamed. While dusting the grand piano in the music room, Margaret overheard Richard's mother, Elizabeth Thompson, speaking to someone on the phone. Her voice carried that distinct tone of old money and social superiority that Margaret had grown accustomed to over the past year. "Yes, darling. Everything's arranged at the Grand Plaza. Richard's been very specific about how he wants things set up." Elizabeth paused, listening. "Oh, you should see the guest list. The Vanderwells are coming, and so are the Prescotts. Their daughter Caroline just returned from finishing school in Switzerland." Margaret's heart sank a little further. The Vanderwells and Prescotts were among the wealthiest families in town. Caroline Prescott had been featured in the society pages of the local newspaper just last week, her blonde hair and designer clothes representing everything Margaret wasn't. As she continued her work, Margaret noticed Richard's best friend Bradley Harrison lounging in the study, feet propped up on an antique ottoman. He was holding a Polaroid camera, the latest model that had just come out that year, and was fiddling with it while talking to Richard. "Got it all set up?" Bradley asked, snapping a test photo. "Everything's perfect," Richard replied, his voice carrying that same smug tone he'd had all week. "I make sure you get plenty of pictures. This is going to be a night everyone remembers." Margaret forced herself to keep working, even as her hands trembled slightly. The way they were talking about pictures made her even more nervous about what might be planned for the evening. During her lunch break, Margaret sat alone in the staff kitchen, picking at her peanut butter sandwich. Mrs. Rivera, the cook who had been with the Thompsons for over 15 years, sat down beside her with a cup of coffee. "I heard you're going to the young master's party tonight," Mrs. Rivera said quietly, her weathered face creased with concern. Margaret nodded, unable to find words to explain why she was walking into what was clearly a trap. "Be careful, mijita," Mrs. Rivera warned, patting Margaret's hand. "I've watched that boy grow up. He can be cruel when he wants to be, just like his mother." "Did you ever see him be kind?" Margaret asked, hoping for some glimmer of hope that she wasn't making a terrible mistake. Mrs. Rivera thought for a moment, stirring her coffee. "Once, when he was very young, maybe 6 or 7, a bird flew into one of the windows and hurt its wing. Richard spent 3 days caring for it in a shoebox, feeding it with an eyedropper." She sighed. But that was before his mother started molding him into her image of what a Thompson should be. The conversation gave Margaret pause. She'd never thought about Richard as anything other than the entitled young man she knew now. The idea that he might have once been different, might still have that kindness buried somewhere deep inside, stuck with her. After finishing her workday, Margaret hurried home to prepare for the evening. Her mother had already laid out everything she would need. The black velvet dress, freshly steamed, a pair of modest black heels they'd found at the thrift store, and her grandmother's pearl necklace, the only real piece of jewelry their family owned. "You don't have to do this," her mother said one last time as she helped Margaret zip up the dress. Margaret looked at herself in the mirror. The dress fit perfectly now, thanks to her mother's alterations. Her dark hair was swept up in a simple but elegant style they'd practiced all week, inspired by a fashion magazine she'd found in the Thompsons' recycling. "I do have to do this, Mom," Margaret replied, touching the pearls at her throat. "Not just for me, but for us. For all the times people like the Thompsons made us feel less than them." Her mother's eyes welled with tears. "You could never be less than them, sweetheart. You're worth more than all their money combined." At 7:30, Margaret called for a taxi, an expense she'd saved up for specifically for this evening. She refused to arrive at the Grand Plaza in their old rusting Chevrolet. The taxi driver, an older man with kind eyes, noticed her nervousness in the rearview mirror. "Big night?" he asked as they drove through the city streets. "You could say that," Margaret replied, watching as the buildings grew taller and more impressive as they approached the wealthy part of town. "Well, whoever they are, show them what you're made of," the driver said with the encouraging smile. The Grand Plaza Hotel loomed ahead, its windows gleaming in the evening light. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway, Mercedes, BMWs, and even a Rolls-Royce. Doormen in crisp uniforms helped elegantly dressed guests from their vehicles. As the taxi pulled up to the entrance, Margaret took a deep breath, remembering her mother's words. She was more than enough, regardless of what Richard Thompson Jr. or anyone else thought. The doorman opened her taxi door with the same courtesy he'd shown the wealthy guests, and for a moment, Margaret felt like she truly belonged. She paid the taxi driver with carefully counted bills and stepped out onto the red carpet that led into the hotel. Inside, the lobby was a marvel of marble and crystal, with potted palms and elegant furniture arranged in intimate groupings. A sign with gold lettering directed guests to the Thompson birthday celebration in the grand ballroom. Margaret followed the signs, her heart pounding with each step. She could hear music and laughter floating down the hallway. As she approached the ballroom's massive double doors, she noticed Bradley standing just inside, still holding his Polaroid camera. His eyes widened when he saw her, and he quickly disappeared into the crowd. Taking one final deep breath, Margaret stepped through the doorway, ready to face whatever Richard had planned. The ballroom was spectacular, with crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over the gathered crowds of elegantly dressed guests. A live band played popular hits from the latest charts, and waiters circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then, Margaret noticed that conversations were stopping as people noticed her. Heads turned, whispers began, and somewhere in the crowd she heard Richard's distinctive laugh. Whatever was about to happen, Margaret stood tall, her grandmother's pearls giving her strength. She was a Wilson, and Wilsons didn't break, not even when walking into the lion's den. The crowd began to part, and Richard emerged, wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo and wearing an expression that made Margaret's blood run cold. But as he approached her, something unexpected happened, something that would change the course of the entire evening. Richard Thompson Jr. approached Margaret with the confidence of someone who held all the cards. His perfectly polished shoes clicked against the marble floor as he walked, each step echoing in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the nearby guests. But just as he opened his mouth to speak, another figure stepped between them. "Richard, darling, aren't you going to introduce me to your guest?" The voice belonged to Eleanor Thompson, Richard's grandmother and family matriarch. She was a striking woman in her 70s, wearing a classic Chanel suit that had probably been purchased in the actual 1950s, not the current revival. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her posture spoke of decades of finishing school training. Richard's face flickered with annoyance at the interruption. "Grandmother, this is just Margaret Wilson," Eleanor finished for him, her eyes sharp and alert despite her age. "Yes, I know exactly who she is, the young lady who's been keeping our home in such wonderful order this past year." Margaret felt her cheeks flush. She hadn't expected anyone in the Thompson family to even know her full name, let alone acknowledge her work. "Mrs. Thompson," Margaret managed to say, attempting a small curtsy she'd practiced in front of her mirror. "Thank you for having me." Eleanor's eyes twinkled with something that looked almost like amusement. "Oh, please call me Eleanor. Mrs. Thompson is my daughter-in-law." She glanced meaningfully at Richard's mother across the room. "And thank you for coming. It's so rare to see young people with real grace these days." Richard shifted uncomfortably beside them. This clearly wasn't how he'd planned the evening to unfold. "Grandmother, I need to—" "Richard, be a dear and fetch Margaret some champagne," Eleanor interrupted smoothly. The good kind. From the private reserve your grandfather laid down, not that domestic stuff they're serving the general crowd." When Richard hesitated, Eleanor's voice took on a steel edge that Margaret hadn't expected. "Now, Richard." As Richard walked away, clearly frustrated, Eleanor linked her arm through Margaret's. "Come with me, dear. There's something I'd like to show you." Eleanor led Margaret through the crowd, which parted respectfully before them. They walked past Bradley, who was still clutching his Polaroid camera with a confused expression, past Caroline Prescott and her finishing school friends who were whispering behind their hands, and toward a quieter corner of the ballroom. "You're probably wondering why I intervened," Eleanor said as they walked. "Let's just say I've seen that look in my grandson's eyes before, and I'm tired of watching history repeat itself." They stopped in front of a large portrait hanging on the ballroom wall. It showed a young woman in a maid's uniform from the 1940s, standing proud despite her humble attire. "That was me," Eleanor said quietly. "Before I married Richard's grandfather, I was working as a maid in his family's home, just like you are now." Margaret stared at the portrait in disbelief. Eleanor Thompson, the family matriarch, had been a maid. But how? Eleanor's lips curved in a small smile. "Charles Thompson, Richard's grandfather, fell in love with me despite his family's objections. We married against their wishes, and he was nearly disinherited. But love won out in the end, as it often does when it's real." She turned to face Margaret directly. "I've watched you this past year, Margaret. You remind me so much of myself at your age. The same determination, the same quiet dignity. When I heard about Richard's invitation to you, I knew exactly what he was planning." Margaret felt tears prickling at her eyes. "You knew he was going to humiliate me." "I knew he was going to try," Eleanor corrected, "just as his uncle tried to humiliate me at my first Thompson family gathering. But I didn't let him then, and I'm not going to let Richard do it to you now." Just then, Richard returned with the champagne, his face a mask of forced politeness. Eleanor took one glass and handed it to Margaret, then took the other for herself, leaving Richard empty-handed. "Thank you, darling," Eleanor said. "Now, why don't you tell us what you really had planned for this evening?" Richard's confident facade cracked slightly. "Grandmother, I don't know what you mean." "Don't lie to me. Richard Charles Thompson Jr." Eleanor's voice was quiet but sharp. "I've seen the Polaroid camera your friend's been carrying around. I've heard the whispers. What was it going to be? Some kind of public humiliation? Perhaps a cruel joke about her clothes or her background?" The colour drained from Richard's face as his grandmother continued. "Did you know that your friend Bradley left his notebook in the library yesterday? The one where you both planned out this entire evening. Mrs. Rivera found it while cleaning and brought it to me." Margaret watched as Richard's composure crumbled under his grandmother's steady gaze. Around them, other guests were starting to take notice of the conversation, but Eleanor didn't seem to care. I just thought it would be funny," Richard stammered, looking younger and less sure of himself than Margaret had ever seen him. "Funny?" Eleanor's voice could have frozen fire. "Tell me, what's funny about hurting someone who has done nothing but work hard and show kindness to our family? What's funny about abusing your position and privilege to make someone else feel small?" The band had stopped playing, and the ballroom had grown quiet enough that Eleanor's words carried to the nearby guests. Margaret saw Caroline Prescott and her friends lower their eyes in shame. "I didn't," Richard started, then stopped, looking at Margaret as if seeing her for the first time. "I didn't think about it that way." "No, you didn't think at all," Eleanor said. "You just followed the same path of cruelty and entitlement that I've watched poison this family for generations. Well, it stops now." She turned to Margaret, her expression softening. "My dear, I apologize for my grandson's behavior. You deserve better than this." Margaret stood straighter, finding strength in Eleanor's words and presence. "Thank you. But I knew something was wrong when I received the invitation. I came anyway because I wanted to prove that I'm not ashamed of who I am or where I come from." Eleanor's smile was full of pride. "And you've proved that beautifully." She turned back to Richard. "You could learn something from Margaret about real class, Richard. It has nothing to do with money or social position, and everything to do with how you treat others." Richard's face had turned red with shame. He looked at Margaret, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time seeing past his own prejudices. I'm sorry," he said quietly. "What I planned was cruel and wrong." But the evening's surprises weren't over yet. As Richard spoke those words, another figure emerged from the crowd, someone whose presence would add yet another unexpected twist to this already remarkable night. Through the parting crowd came Thomas Thompson, Richard's father and the current head of the Thompson family. Unlike his son's obvious discomfort, Thomas carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned his position rather than inherited it. His salt and pepper hair and Brooks Brothers suit gave him an air of authority that commanded attention without demanding it. "I believe I can shed some light on why my son might have acted this way," Thomas said, his voice carrying the same measured tone that Margaret had heard during his business calls. "Richard, would you like to tell everyone about the conversation we had in my study last week?" Richard's face, already flushed with embarrassment, turned an even deeper shade of red. "Father, please." "No, then allow me." Thomas turned to address both Margaret and Eleanor. "Last week, I informed Richard that starting this summer, he would be working his way up through our company from the ground floor, just as I did. No executive position, no special treatment." Margaret watched as Richard shifted uncomfortably, avoiding everyone's eyes. She'd never seen him look so vulnerable. "He was quite upset about it," Thomas continued, "said something about how it wasn't fair, how none of his friends had to work their way up. I suspect this," he gestured to the party scene around them, "was his way of proving that he was better than those who work for a living." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "So this whole cruel scheme was about your wounded pride, Richard." "I didn't want to be like them," Richard burst out, then immediately looked ashamed of his words. I didn't want to." "Be like me." Margaret found her voice, surprising herself with its steadiness. "Someone who works hard for what they have, someone who doesn't rely on their family name to get ahead." The silence that followed her words was deafening. Even the band seemed to hold its breath. "Yes," Richard finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was scared. I've never had to prove myself before." Thomas stepped forward, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "And that, Richard, is exactly why you need this experience. Real respect isn't inherited, it's earned." Margaret watched this exchange with mixed emotions. Part of her was still hurt by Richard's planned humiliation, but another part recognized something familiar in his fear. Hadn't she felt that same fear every day, walking into the Thompson mansion, worried she wouldn't measure up. Eleanor, who'd been quietly observing, suddenly laughed. Oh, the irony of it all. Richard, did you know that your father also started in the mailroom? That he insisted on it, even though your grandfather offered him a management position right out of college? Richard's head snapped up, looking at his father in surprise. You never told me that. You never asked, Thomas replied simply. I were too busy trying to be what you thought a Thompson should be, instead of finding out who you really are. The band had resumed playing softly in the background, a gentle melody from Cyndi Lauper's Time After Time, filling the awkward silence that followed. Around them, the party guests had begun to drift away, sensing that the evening's drama was shifting into something more private. I think, Eleanor said, her voice gentle but firm, that it's time for some changes in this family, starting with how we treat people, all people. She turned to Margaret. My dear, would you be interested in a different position within the Thompson household? I could use a personal assistant, someone with your attention to detail and strong work ethic. Before Margaret could respond, Thomas added, and Richard will be starting in the mailroom next week. Perhaps, Margaret, you could give him some advice about hard work and dignity. He clearly has a lot to learn in both areas. Richard looked at Margaret, and for the first time, she saw something new in his eyes. Not the usual condescension or mock politeness, but genuine remorse and perhaps a hint of admiration. I would appreciate any advice you're willing to give, he said quietly. I've been a fool. Margaret stood there, feeling the weight of all that had happened. The evening had started with her expecting humiliation, but instead had offered her an opportunity she'd never imagined possible, yet something still didn't feel quite right. With all due respect, she began, gathering her courage, I appreciate the offer, Mrs. Thompson, Eleanor, but I think I need some time to think about it. This evening has been overwhelming. Eleanor's smile widened. Of course, dear. Take all the time you need. A wise person never makes important decisions in haste. As the party continued around them, Margaret found herself in a strange new position. The very people who had come expecting to laugh at her were now treating her with a newfound respect, but even as she accepted their kindness, she couldn't help but notice that Richard kept glancing her way, his expression unreadable. What Margaret didn't know was that this evening was far from over. As she sipped her champagne and watched the couples dancing, she had no idea that the biggest surprise of the night was yet to come, a revelation that would change not only her future, but Richard's as well. As the evening wore on, the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel began to thin out. The band had switched to slower songs, playing Lionel Richie's Hello as couples swayed on the dance floor. Margaret stood near one of the tall windows, watching the city lights twinkle below, still processing everything that had happened. She felt a presence beside her and turned to find Richard standing there, his bow tie slightly loosened, looking more human than she'd ever seen him. Would you like to get some air? He asked, gesturing toward the terrace doors. His voice lacked its usual arrogance, replaced by something that sounded almost like uncertainty. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. They walked out onto the terrace, the cool evening air a welcome relief from the warmth of the ballroom. The city spread out before them, a maze of lights and shadows, while somewhere in the distance, a car horn honked to the rhythm of the latest Madonna song playing from someone's stereo. I used to hide in the garden when I was younger, Richard said suddenly, breaking the silence. Whenever my mother had her society parties, I'd sit behind the rose bushes and read comic books until Mrs. Rivera would find me and bring me cookies. Margaret looked at him, surprised by this unexpected confession. Why are you telling me this? Because, he said, leaning against the terrace railing, that was the last time I remember feeling real, before I started trying to be what everyone expected a Thompson to be. The honesty in his voice made Margaret pause. She thought about Mrs. Rivera's story of the young Richard caring for an injured bird. What happened to the bird? She asked. What bird? The one you found when you were 6 or 7. Mrs. Rivera told me about it. Richard's face softened with recognition. She remembered that. He looked out at the city lights. I named her Lucy. When she was better, I didn't want to let her go. But my father, he sat me down and explained that sometimes loving something means letting it be free. Margaret watched his profile in the dim light. That doesn't sound like someone who would plan to humiliate their maid at their birthday party. No, Richard agreed quietly. It doesn't. He turned to face her. I'm not proud of what I planned tonight. I was angry about having to work my way up, and I took it out on you because you represent everything I'm afraid of becoming. And what's that? Someone who has to prove themselves, someone who can't rely on their family name to open doors. He laughed bitterly. Pretty pathetic, isn't it? Actually, Margaret said, it's human. We're all afraid of something, Richard. I'm afraid every day when I walk into your house, afraid I'll break something expensive, afraid I'll say the wrong thing, afraid I won't be good enough. But you never show it, Richard said. You just do your job, with dignity. Because that's what my mother taught me. That dignity isn't about what you have, it's about how you carry yourself. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the muffled music from the ballroom. The band was now playing time after time again, the melody drifting out onto the terrace. My father's right, you know, Richard said finally, about starting from the bottom. I've never earned anything in my life. Everything's been handed to me, and I've been terrible to people like you who actually work for what they have. Margaret turned to look at him. You can change that. Starting in the mailroom, it's an opportunity, not a punishment. Would you? Richard hesitated, then continued. Would you really be willing to give me advice, help me learn? Before Margaret could answer, the terrace doors opened, and Eleanor stepped out. Ah, there you are. Margaret, dear, your mother's on the phone at the front desk. She was worried when she couldn't reach you at home. Margaret excused herself quickly, leaving Richard and his grandmother alone on the terrace. As she walked through the ballroom, she heard whispers from the remaining guests. But they were different now, curious rather than cruel. At the front desk, Margaret spoke to her mother, assuring her that everything was fine, better than fine, actually. When she hung up, she turned to find Thomas Thompson waiting for her. "Will you walk with me for a moment?" he asked. They walked through the hotel's elegant lobby, their footsteps echoing on the marble floor. "I want you to know," Thomas said, "that the offer of a position as my mother-in-law's assistant is genuine. But I'd like to make another proposal as well. We're starting a new training program at Thompson Industries, aimed at helping promising young people advance in the business world. Full college tuition coverage included." Margaret stopped walking, stunned. "Mr. Thompson, You don't have to decide now," he said kindly. "But I've watched how you work this past year. You have exactly the kind of intelligence and work ethic we need, and it might be good for Richard to have someone like you going through the program alongside him." Margaret's mind was spinning. College had always been a distant dream, something she could never afford, and now. Back on the terrace, Richard was still deep in conversation with his grandmother, unaware that his father's offer to Margaret would set in motion events that would change both their lives in ways neither could imagine. As the night drew to a close, Margaret found herself looking at the Thompson family and herself in a completely new light. But the evening's most significant moment was still to come. A moment that would transform everything she thought she knew about herself, about Richard, and about the true meaning of dignity and worth. Monday morning arrived with a different kind of nervousness for Margaret. She walked up the familiar driveway of the Thompson mansion, but this time she wasn't wearing her maid's uniform. Instead, she wore a modest but professional skirt and blouse she'd bought from the clearance rack at JCPenney with her savings. The weekend had been a blur of conversations with her mother about Thomas Thompson's offer. They'd stayed up late both nights, weighing the pros and cons, discussing possibilities they'd never dared to consider before. "Things like this don't happen to people like us," her mother had said, but there was hope in her voice rather than bitterness. As Margaret reached for the doorbell, something she'd never done before, the door opened. Richard stood there, looking different himself, in a simple button-down shirt and khakis, no designer labels in sight. "I was watching for you," he admitted, seeming almost shy. "I thought we could drive to the office together, since we're both starting today." Margaret hesitated. "I haven't actually given my answer yet." "Oh." Richard's face fell slightly. "Right. Of course." He stepped aside to let her enter. "Grandmother's waiting for you in the library." The library had always been Margaret's favorite room to clean, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and comfortable leather chairs. Now, Eleanor Thompson sat in one of those chairs, elegant as ever in her morning attire. "Ah, Margaret, right on time." Eleanor gestured to the chair opposite her. "Please, sit. Would you like some tea?" As Margaret sat down, she noticed a familiar book on the side table, a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice that she'd often longed to read during her cleaning duties. "I've seen you looking at this book," Eleanor said, following her gaze. "You enjoy reading?" "Yes," Margaret replied. "When I can. The library at school was my favorite place." Eleanor smiled. "Mine too, when I was your age. Though I had to sneak my reading in between cleaning duties." She poured tea into delicate cups. "Have you thought about Thomas's offer?" Margaret took a deep breath. "I have, but I'm worried. What if I'm not good enough? What if I fail?" "Oh, my dear." Eleanor set down her teacup. "Do you know what the difference is between you and most of the young people in Richard's social circle? They've never had to wonder if they're good enough. They've never had to work for anything. But you've already proven your worth 100 times over. But college, business, it's all so different from what I know." "Is it?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Tell me, what does it take to be a good maid?" Margaret thought for a moment. "Attention to detail, organization, the ability to anticipate needs, discretion, hard work. And what do you think it takes to be successful in business?" The parallel suddenly became clear to Margaret. Eleanor smiled at her realization. "Exactly. You already have the skills, Margaret. You just need the opportunity to apply them differently." Eleanor leaned forward. "But I want you to understand something. This isn't charity. This is an investment. In you, in this company's future. And yes, even in Richard's development." "Richard?" Margaret asked him, surprised. "My grandson needs to learn what real work looks like, what real character looks like. And I think you can teach him that, even if neither of you realizes it yet." Before Margaret could respond, there was a knock at the library door. Richard entered, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Sorry to interrupt, but if Margaret's coming to the office today, we should leave soon. Traffic's getting heavy." Eleanor looked at Margaret expectantly. In that moment, Margaret thought about everything that had happened since the party, the conversations with her mother, the dreams she'd never dared to voice. And yes, even the way Richard had changed in just these few days. "I'll need to change," Margaret said, standing up. I brought clothes for cleaning." "No need," Eleanor said, eyes twinkling. "I took the liberty of having your cleaning duties reassigned. Your new life starts today, if you want it to." Margaret looked from Eleanor to Richard, then back again. "Yes," she said finally. "Yes, I want to try." The drive to Thompson Industries was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Richard kept glancing at Margaret when he thought she wasn't looking, clearly wanting to say something, but not finding the words. Finally, as they pulled into the parking garage, he spoke. "I'm glad you said yes." "Really?" Margaret couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. "Really?" Richard turned off the engine but didn't move to get out. "I meant what I said at the party. I want to learn, and I think maybe we can learn from each other." As they walked into the imposing office building together, both nervous for different reasons, neither of them could have predicted how their relationship would evolve over the coming months. But something had already changed between them, something that went beyond social status or family names. They were no longer the entitled son and the humble maid. They were just two young people starting out, facing their fears together, about to embark on a journey that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. And as they stepped into the elevator that would take them to their first day of training, Margaret caught Richard's reflection in the mirrored walls. For just a moment, she saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip a beat, something that suggested this story was far from over. 3 months passed quickly at Thompson Industries. Autumn painted the city in shades of gold and red, and the office buzzed with the energy of new beginnings. Margaret had surprised everyone, including herself, with her natural aptitude for business, her attention to detail and organizational skills, honed from her days as a maid, translated perfectly into the corporate world. Richard, true to his word, had thrown himself into learning everything from the ground up. Gone was the entitled young man who looked down on others. In his place was someone who stayed late to help sort mail, who learned every employee's name, who actually listened when Margaret explained more efficient ways to do things. They'd fallen into a comfortable routine of carpooling to work together, sharing coffee breaks in the building's small cafe, and occasionally staying late to help each other with projects. Their colleagues had noticed the change in both of them, particularly in Richard, whose transformation from arrogant heir to humble learner had become something of a quiet legend in the office. One crisp October evening, as they were finishing up their work, Richard looked up from his desk to find Margaret still focused on organizing some files. "Hey," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. "Remember that bird I told you about? Lucy." Margaret looked up, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "The one you helped when you were little." "Of course. I've been thinking about her lately. About what my father said about letting her go." Richard stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the dusk. "I think I finally understand what he meant." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked, joining him at the window. "Sometimes you have to let go of who you thought you were supposed to be to become who you really are." He turned to look at her. "I had to let go of being Richard Thompson Jr. to just be Richard." Margaret smiled. "And who is Richard?" "Still figuring that out," he admitted. "But I like him better than the guy who invited you to that party to humiliate you. I'm still so ashamed of that." "You're not that person anymore," Margaret said quietly. "People can change. I've watched you change." Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. But before either could speak, Eleanor appeared in the doorway. "Still here, you two? I thought everyone had gone home." "Just finishing up, grandmother," Richard said, stepping back slightly from Margaret. "Did you need something?" "Actually, yes." Eleanor entered the office fully. "I wanted to invite you both to dinner tomorrow night. We're celebrating your father's birthday, Richard and Margaret. Dear, you've become such a part of our family these past months." "Oh, I couldn't impose on a family celebration," Margaret began, but Eleanor waved away her protests. "Nonsense. Thomas specifically asked for you to be there. He's quite impressed with your work, you know." After Eleanor left, Richard turned to Margaret. "Please come. It won't be like the party. I promise." Margaret looked at him, at the earnestness in his eyes, so different from the mocking gleam they'd held just a few months ago. "Okay," she said. "I'll come." The next evening, Margaret arrived at the Thompson mansion, this time through the front door. The family dinner was nothing like the grand party had been. It was intimate, warm, filled with genuine laughter and conversation. Even Richard's mother, Elizabeth, had softened toward Margaret, especially after seeing how her son had changed. After dinner, while the others moved to the living room for coffee, Richard asked Margaret if she'd like to see the garden. The October air was cool, and Richard draped his jacket over her shoulders as they walked among the roses that Mrs. Rivera still tenderly maintained. "This is where I used to hide," Richard said, pointing to a spot behind some bushes. Right there." Margaret could picture it, a young Richard curled up with his comic books, trying to escape the expectations that weighed on him. "Do you ever wish you could go back, be that kid again?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I wouldn't be who I am now. I wouldn't have learned what really matters." He turned to face her. "I wouldn't have met you. Not really met you, I mean, not as a person." Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. "Richard, you know what's funny?" he continued, his voice soft in the gathering darkness. "That party, I planned it to hurt you, to make myself feel better about having to work my way up. Instead, it changed everything. You changed everything." They had stopped walking, standing now in a pool of light from the garden lamps. The distant sound of cars and city life seemed to fade away, leaving just them, this moment, this garden. "Margaret," Richard said, taking her hand gently, "I think I'm falling in love with you. Not because you've helped me become a better person, though you have, not because you're brilliant at your job, though you are, but because you're you, strong, kind, dignified, real." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. "Richard, we're from such different worlds." "No," he said firmly. "We're not. Not anymore." These past months have taught me that the worlds I thought were so different don't really exist. There's just people, real people, trying their best, learning, growing, loving. He reached up to brush away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. I don't care what anyone thinks. I don't care about social status or family names or any of that anymore. I care about you. Margaret looked into his eyes, seeing nothing but sincerity there. I think, she said slowly, I might be falling in love with you too. Richard smiled, that real, genuine smile she'd come to know over the past months. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and kissed her. It was soft, sweet, and perfect. Their first kiss, in the garden where a young boy had once hidden from the world. When they broke apart, they heard applause from the terrace. Eleanor stood there with Thomas and Elizabeth, all smiling. Even Mrs. Rivera had come out from the kitchen to watch, wiping tears from her eyes. Well, Eleanor said, her voice carrying across the garden, it's about time. Later that night, as Margaret's mother helped her get ready for bed, just like when she was little, she asked, Are you happy, sweetheart? Margaret thought about everything. The party that had started it all, the changes in Richard, the opportunities she'd been given, the kiss in the garden. Yes, she said, touching her lips where she could still feel Richard's kiss. I really am. And she was. Because sometimes the greatest love stories don't start with love at first sight. Sometimes they start with misconceptions and mistakes, with people learning and growing and becoming better versions of themselves. Sometimes they start with a party meant to humiliate and end with a kiss in a garden where a little boy once hid with his comic books. As for Richard and Margaret, their story was just beginning. There would be challenges ahead, of course, and society doesn't change overnight, and some people would always try to remind them of where they came from, but they faced it all together. Two people who had learned that real worth isn't about where you start, but about who you choose to become. And in the years to come, whenever anyone asked how they fell in love, they'd smile at each other and say it started with a party. But the real story began the day they both decided to become the people they were meant to be. Thank you for watching today's story. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a big thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel to relive the magic of the 80s every day with our heartfelt stories. May God bless you and your family. And don't forget to click on the video popping up on the screen right now. It's another totally rad story you won't want to miss. See you in the next video, and stay awesome.